Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of History Bites. My name is Julia Ashworth. I am Gunston Hall's civic engagement educator and will be the moderator for our July program. This month we're featuring Dr. Maggie Kirsh from the Religious Studies Department at the College of William and Mary to continue our Freedom of Religion mini-series. She will be highlighting what the promise of freedom of religion has meant to the American Jewish community, both past and present. Dr. Maggie Fraser Kirsh is a visiting assistant professor of Judaic studies at the College of William and Mary. She earned her BA in history from this same college, her MST in Jewish studies from Oxford University, and her PhD in modern Jewish history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests include Jewish childhood, memoir writing, and Jewish life in post-Holocaust Europe. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Maggie.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia. I'm really looking forward to this.
Alrighty, so as Maggie is pulling up her presentation, I do want to speak to all of our viewers here today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop them into the chat here on YouTube Live or email us at historic@gunstonhall.org. I'll share them a little bit further along in the program. Alrighty, take it away, Maggie.
All right, thank you, Julia. So my talk for today is entitled "In Search of the Vine and Fig Tree: Jewish Voices for Religious Freedom in the Land of Promise." And so what I would like to do today, just to give you an overview of where I'll be taking you, we're going to look at the general landscape of what religious freedom means for American Jews. And we're going to start our history in a nod to, our nation's 250th anniversary this summer. We're going to begin our story with George Washington. So not all of the voices you hear today will be Jewish voices, but they are all voices that are contributing to this conversation of not only what is religious liberty and what does it mean specifically to Jewish Americans, but what is the kind of work that's required in order to preserve that. So we'll look at George Washington. Because Julia and I are both speaking from the Commonwealth of Virginia, I'm going to pull in some other voices from Virginia as well. And then towards the end, I'll look at the landscape of religious freedom for American Jews today. So I would like to begin, though, with some very contemporary quotes from a rabbi and professor, David Saperstein, who, among other titles in the past, he worked as an ambassador at large for international religious freedom. So he's quite the expert on this topic. And he noted that the United States, as a nation that has given the Jewish people more rights, more freedoms, and more opportunities than we have ever known in 2,500 years of diaspora Jewish life. And he goes on to explain that only in America have Jews been free to pursue our faith and to organize our communal lives, equal under law and in practice, without government interference. So there's lots of places where you can start a story. I'm going to be starting our story in 1790. And in order to settle you into this story that's happening in the summer of 1790, I want to give you a little bit of the context. So George Washington, this is just a little bit more than a year after he was inaugurated as the nation's first president. And he finds himself in the summer of 1790 visiting members representing different houses of worship in the state of Rhode Island. This was part of a trip that followed the state's ratification of the Constitution. So different religious representatives from different houses of worship in Newport are writing letters and petitions to George Washington. And among those letters, we have one that comes from Congregation Yeshua Israel. Now, it's important to know that the ancestors of some of the members of this congregation had experienced religious persecution in both Spain and Portugal. In Spain in 1492, Jews had been expelled, and something similar happens in Portugal in 1496. So it's not too far back in their own personal familial history that they've experienced significant religious persecution. Now, there's a lay leader in the synagogue, Moses Seixas, who's chosen to pen the congregation's address to George Washington. And he addresses the president with great warmth, saying, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits." He goes on to say, "We desire to send up our thanks to the Ancient of Days, the great preserver of men," meaning God, "beseeching God that the angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness into the promised land may graciously conduct you through all the dangers and difficulties of a mortal life." And above all, he expresses great thankfulness to God for all the blessings of civil and religious liberty, which we enjoy under an equal and benign administration. Because this was such a new experience for Jews to be able to enjoy this kind of liberty under an equal and benign administration. And he goes on to say he recalls their very recent past when they were still colonies under British rule, saying that deprived as we have hitherto been, meaning the colonists, of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. So, a very eloquent letter. It's drawing on these biblical allusions. It's drawing on this shared suffering of not being full citizens before and having this opportunity now. And George Washington's reply that comes a few days later is equally thoughtful and also draws upon a number of biblical allusions. He reiterates Seixas's points, sometimes verbatim, and emphasizes again that something key is changing. And I pulled out of his letter this text in particular, where he writes, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights." And this here is really key. The idea that freedom of religion is not something to be bestowed upon people as a gift, but it's an inherent natural right. It's not something that you have to earn or to prove your worthiness of or to receive it from another power. It's inherent in all of us as human beings. Interestingly, George Washington concludes his letter to this congregation with his own biblical allusions, where he writes, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Now, of course, for all of you Hamilton fans out there, this image of the vine and fig tree is featured in the musical's number One Last Time, where it's sung by Washington as he prepares to step down from the presidency. I won't torture you with my singing, but the lyrics in Hamilton read as thus: "Everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. They'll be safe in the nation we've made." Now, of course, this line does not originate with George Washington or from Hamilton, the musical. It comes from Micah 4:4, a prophet within the Hebrew Bible. And based on the number of times that Washington refers to Micah 4:4 in his writings, it appears to have been perhaps a favorite passage of his. And it was a very popular image during the American Revolution as well. Now, that the members of this congregation, many of whom were likely descended from Jews who had fled significant religious persecution in Spain and Portugal, for them to receive such a personal message from the new president, this is an incredibly powerful moment. Here is a country that promises religious liberty, not as something to be earned, but as an inherent right. And we see echoes of this appreciation in other writings of American Jews in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. I'll give you another quick example from Virginia. Here we have a letter penned by Rebecca Samuel. She was from Hamburg in modern day Germany. She had settled with her husband in Petersburg, Virginia, where they were planning to raise their children. And in some of the correspondence that she sends back home, she reflects on what it's like to be a Jew in America. And she assures her parents, quote, "One can make a good living here and all live in peace. Anyone can do what he wants. There's no rabbi in all of America to excommunicate anyone. There is a blessing here. Jew and Gentile are as one. There is no galut, meaning like a rejection here." And she emphasizes several times to her parents the power of being able to live here peacefully as Jews. Now, as we move into the 19th century, we continue to see American Jewish voices proudly proclaiming their country as a safe haven. And an interesting example of this comes from Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who was an editor, a politician, and a playwright. And he writes in 1825 of his desire to build a Jewish homeland of sorts on an island in the Niagara River near Buffalo, New York. And I've included a passage from this, and you'll see again, we've got these biblical allusions. Where in this petition, in this announcement, he's announcing to the Jews throughout the world that an asylum is prepared and hereby offered to them, where they can enjoy that peace, comfort, and happiness which has been denied them through the intolerance and misgovernment of former ages, where industry is encouraged, education promoted, and good faith rewarded. A land of milk and honey, where Israel, meaning Jews, may repose in peace under his vine and fig tree. Now, Mordechai Emanuel Noah proposed that this refuge would be called Ararat, which is the name of the place where Noah's Ark finally comes to rest after the great flood, where Noah can finally catch his breath, where he sees this vision of a peaceful future, of the ability to start over. This project of Noah's, of Mordechai Emanuel Noah's, this utopian vision, it never materialized. It did not have widespread support, but it's still significant because it's a fascinating example, I think, that shows a clear awareness that what the Jews had in the US was special. And it's also a response to a very real need of Jews around the world for a city of refuge. And that brings me to my last example for today, my last historical example, and that is the story of Mary Anton. Now, thanks to widespread violence, Jews like Mary Anton and her family were desperate for a safe place to call home. Mary Anton, who's pictured here, she's the younger of the two sisters. She was born in 1881 in Polotsk, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. The same year that her mother gave birth to her, the Russian Empire was in the throes of what was called pogroms, these outbursts of serious physical violence directed at very vulnerable Jewish communities. Now, harsh decrees towards the Jews were not new in Eastern Europe. But before 1880, many of the Tsar's decrees were passed in the so-called name of reform. But all this changes in 1881 when the state's official government policy and turbulent politics are targeting Jews. And it's not just official government policy and the turbulent politics that's making the lives of Jews increasingly difficult. There's also a spike of religious hatred of Jews, and that hatred was marked by sustained violence. This culminated in a series of violent attacks that begins the year Mary Anton is born in 1881 and lasts until 1884. Now, while the Tsar's government did not directly orchestrate these programs, local authorities rarely intervened to quell the violence. These pogroms left thousands of Russian Jews wounded and homeless, and everyone terrified. Even the most assimilated Jews, individuals who had written of previous anti-Semitic incidents and said, oh, they're just the result of ignorance, not hatred, they too are very shaken by this violence, and many of them begin to consider that a future in the Russian Empire, it's not possible. Their lives there are not sustainable. And the pogroms are followed in 1882 by something called the May Laws that forced Jews to move out of the villages that they had called home. They're forcibly relocated to other areas. And in these new areas, there were very few prospects for employment. You couldn't buy or rent property, or if you were a Jew, you were ineligible for a lot of civil service jobs. And there were quotas that were established by the Russian Ministry of Education, making it very difficult for Jews to obtain an education in the Russian Empire. Now, as a child, Mary Anton was fed stories about the violence, even though she had been too young to have seen it firsthand. She was also born into a world in which there was no separation of church and state. And she writes in her memoir, by the time I fully understood that I was a prisoner, the shackles had grown familiar to my flesh. Her family had no recourse against the attacks, even attacks that were lobbied against them by children. There was one neighborhood boy, Ivanka, who taunted Mary, threw mud at her. And when she went home and she told her mother what had happened, her mother's response was, how can I help you? Ivanka is a Gentile. The Gentiles do as they like with us Jews. Mary Anton's world was very narrow, and she writes about this in her memoir about how stifling this world was. And what made it narrow was a lack of educational opportunities. These were opportunities that were denied to her, not just as a girl, but as a Jewish girl. High school, there was only a limited number of Jews who were admitted. They had higher standards that were applied to them. They had to jump through more hoops in order to obtain that education. There were limits on mobility. Jews were required to live within a region called the Pale of Settlement. It was illegal to be a Jew outside of the Pale unless you had very special permission. And there were also limited economic opportunities as well. So Mary Anton's father, in response to the narrowness, the increasing narrowness of their world, immigrates to the United States when Mary Anton is about 10. He works for several years to be able to afford passage for his family. And she explains that her father saw something. He promised us something. It was this America, and America became my dream. Thanks to the separation of church and state in the US, Anton's world was no longer so narrow. And above all, she appreciated the opportunities that she was afforded by public education, saying that the apex of my civic pride and personal contentment was reached on the bright September morning when I entered the public school. She goes on to say, it was I that ran away on winged feet of joy and expectation. And when she was a schoolgirl, she really revered George Washington above all others, identifying him as responsible for crafting the nation in which she found all of these opportunities. And she wrote, and this is a poem that she wrote as a child, about how difficult it was to be a Jew in so much of the rest of the world, and how much easier they could breathe and how much they could rest. And again, that's an allusion to that idea of resting under the vine and fig tree. Well, Anton calls the United States her promised land, a name in Judaism that more often refers to the land of Israel. Life in the United States, of course, was not an easy paradise. Discrimination still existed, but anti-Semitism wasn't embedded in the foundations of this nation. And it was the separation of church and state that enabled her more mobility than she ever dreamed. Not only could she go to school and pursue whatever kind of career she wanted to, there were also other public spaces that were open to her that as a child in Polotsk wouldn't have been imaginable, like the Boston Public Library and the Society of Natural History, both which were really crucial in forming her identity. And then I want to conclude today with a few words about what this legacy of religious freedom means to American Jews. Because above all, religious freedom is ongoing work. Religious pluralism is necessary for a healthy democracy. It's necessary for the preservation of religious freedom. The idea of religious freedom is a great value. but it means nothing if it's not put into action and continually protected. And in the spirit of religious pluralism, I've here highlighted this idea from an American Muslim, Ibu Patel, who writes in his brilliant book, "In my head, I loved ideas. In my gut, I knew they counted only when they were connected with reality. Pluralism is an intentional commitment that is imprinted through action." And there are many Jewish texts throughout history that call upon this kind of sustained work to protect not only your own religious liberty, but that of others, is very central. The first century BCE Rabbi Hillel summed up the core of Judaism when he said, "That what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Now go and study it." In Judaism, study is social, it's very active. Studying is a way of growing closer to God and a way of repairing the world. It's something that is to spur human beings into action. There's also an awareness in Judaism that this work is continual. And we see this sentiment from Pirkei Avot. You're not obligated to complete the work because you can't, but you're not free to desist from it. This is not work that can be created and completed in an entire generation. You don't just inherit a set of doctrines and poetic ideals. You have to work for them within Judaism to protect them. And I think we see that same need to protect these doctrines and ideals here as part of the American project to continue to ensure religious pluralism. And there's always new challenges in every generation. Today, it's the rise of Christian nationalism, as seen by the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, the shooting at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, and also from the Muslim ban in 2017 and a Jewish response to this. Because in a country where Jews have benefited from religious freedom, there's also a feeling of an obligation to protect that freedom for others as well. And this is the most repeated commandment in all of in all of the Tanakh, in all of the Hebrew Bible, to protect the stranger in the midst, because you once were a stranger as well. And lastly, I'll just mention Faith 250, which is an organization that started just last year. It was established by a Virginia rabbi, Rabbi Michael Holtzman, of Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation. And this is one example of a road forward. It's a national group consisting of faith leaders and congregants that represent over 230 congregations in the US of all different kinds of background. And the idea that drives this organization is that citizenship requires work that's social. And democracy must be built on relationships to preserve the rights of citizens. That these relationships take care and attention and nurturing, but above all else, it requires listening. And so to go back to that letter that I opened with, that exchange between Washington and Moses Sishash, is this idea that in order for everyone to sit under their own vine and fig tree, it requires a lot of listening. It requires a partnership. And it requires this notion that religious liberty, religious freedom is something you cannot take for granted. That you're never going to be completely at rest under the vine and fig tree because you need to be preserving those rights for people in the future.
That was such a wonderful presentation, Maggie. Thank you so very much
Thank you, Julia.
for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today.
I'm happy to.
So I do have a couple of questions for you. The first being, I know that at the beginning of this talk, you mentioned this idea of religious tolerance versus the freedom to practice. And this is something that here on History Bites, we talked about last month in our June Freedom of Religion mini-series with Dr. Charles Haynes, who was really speaking about how this freedom was first written into the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and then later on the United States Bill of Rights. And so I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth as to why this shift in language actually matters, why it matters to define religious freedom as free practice as opposed to tolerance.
Certainly. I mean, I think, tolerance is kind of it sounds good. It's a good bare minimum. And I think it comes back to this idea that you can legislate to protect this, but you can't necessarily legislate people's hearts. That takes a lot longer. And so we see, even though the Enlightenment values that are being espoused in Europe and in the 18th century, they're calling for tolerance. Oftentimes, these calls for tolerance, or even towards Jews, are coming from people who don't like Jews. But more of this idea that, because of inherent rights, like we've got to do this for everybody, and respect this. Um, but toleration is a vulnerable thing. And Jews living in places like Iran, places like the Russian Empire, places like Yemen, they've all had periods where toleration was there, but toleration can come and go, on the whims of whoever is in charge. And to have instead these promises legally and baked. Like, yes, you can't legislate people's hearts, but there is that hope that with ongoing conversation and work, that you transition from mere tolerance to really full acceptance.
Absolutely. That's brilliantly put. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It's um, the idea that with toleration, these laws could change. Um, Now, sort of going a little bit more into that, I did want to ask you a little bit about your own work on post-Holocaust Jewish identity. And I know that this presentation itself was really focused on the early American Jewish experience, but I do want to make sure that we tie your own work into this talk here. And I'm sort of wondering, in what ways can we see this freedom approached a little bit differently here in the United States in the mid to late 20th century, um, as opposed to early on? Is there a difference? Is there not? What does it look like?
Mhm. So I think, and this is something I didn't quite, get to, so I'm glad that you brought this up. When we talk about religious freedom, particularly in relationship to Jews, Judaism is a very complex thing. And of course, this is true for all of religions, but I think particularly with Judaism, where it's often seen as an ethnicity, it's seen as a culture. You have a wide variety of different ideologies as well. But we see increasingly in the late 19th century and early 20th century this tendency to not see Judaism as any of those things, but to see Jews as members of a race that is inherently inferior to other races. And so, again, all of those promises of the Enlightenment, the promises of emancipation, they're all dashed. Jews don't live fully as citizens in Europe for very long until the Holocaust until the Holocaust approaches. And I think that's, again, one of those things that's really needed, because it's very easy to talk about religious freedom and religious liberty, of course, and to have those mean empty things. But I think once we get to the complexity of these individuals and these complexities of these religions, there's a far greater appreciation for the humanity of these individuals as well. And so during the Holocaust, it's not just assault on religious freedom. It's an assault on Jews' ability to live at all. And that's what I was hoping to do in this presentation today. Very different from my own research, but to go back to those voices, to see what are Jews saying about themselves, about their own positions, about their own identities, and what it is that they need and what they benefit from. But also because they've been afforded these protections in the United States that they didn't have, for example, in France in 1942 or Poland in 1944, with that history of that freedom, how can that experience be used to preserve that, to guarantee it for other people, not just Jews, but for people of different faiths and ethnicities and cultures as well.
Absolutely. That idea of, humanity. We are all um, people, regardless of race, regardless of religion. So that is a really beautiful sentiment. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, it comes from a Jewish teaching that all human beings are created B'Tselem Elohim is the Hebrew, meaning like in the image of God. And
Okay.
so if you see the divinity in other people, regardless of what you think about God, but if you can recognize the divinity in other people, again, it's not just about tolerance. It becomes something much more.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you so very much for our audience for joining us today for our final bite in our Freedom of Religion mini-series. Join us next month for a new mini-series on women and politics. We will be speaking with Catherine Garrett from Encyclopedia Virginia. She is also the host of the podcast, Your Most Humble and Obedient Servant. We will be speaking with her on Wednesday, August 19th. We hope to see you then, and as always, stay hungry. All right, we're done.
Thank you, Julia. That was